Welcome. I am Leo Lefebvre of Georgetown University and the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. I am delighted to welcome you to this two-day webinar on 500 years of Christianity and the global Filipinx. As is the custom for Christian Filipinos, we begin this gathering in prayer. The prayers will be offered in 5 of the more than 170 indigenous languages of the Philippines.
Ngala ng kaloobang walang kasing ganda at ng mukhang lubos na kaaya-aya at ng paramdam na tunay na nakagiginhawa. Ginoo nga magbubuhat, Ginoo sa among mga katigulangan. Among nasinati ang imong mahigugmaong kaayo, diha sa hulagway ni Jesus imong anak, kansang sugilano nagdasig kanamo sa among timuha sa maangayon nga katilingban, diin ang tanan mahilakip. Kapamilataning kasal pantayanan apig kalumo kay kami, saupan mo kaming magsikap baning yato maginyang kalupaning kay kang kayarian. Sa diin may pagpaambitanay sa mga bahandi sang kalibutan, kag wala na sang may ginagutom, sa diin may pagtahod sa mga magkalain-lain nga mga tribo kag kultura, kag ang paghidait nga napasad sa hustisya ang labaw nga manggagahom sa tanan. Dawaten mi daytoy babaen tinaga ni Jesus nga nasantuan nga apo tayo kenti panangibabaet ni Santa Maria nga ina tayo. Amen.
Welcome to this two-day webinar on 500 years of Christianity and the global Filipinx, a collaborative effort of the Berkeley Center, De La Salle University in the Philippines, and BBI, the Australian Institute of Theological Education. I would like especially to thank Professor Cristina Yedo Gomez and Professor Agnes Brazal for their leadership in organizing these conversations that critically analyze the significance of this anniversary in the context of the migration of Filipinos around the world, including to the United States. Georgetown University and the Berkeley Center are very happy to host this webinar. Welcome to all. I would like to invite you to submit questions for discussion by using the Q&A function on your screen. Please state the country you are coming from and the speaker to whom you are addressing the question. Our chair for today's session will be Dr. Agnes Brazal from De La Salle University in Manila, the Philippines. Dr. Brazal is the author of numerous award-winning publications on feminism, migration, cyber, and post-colonial theological ethics in Asia. In the chat box, you will find a list of her key publications and awards, as well as the leadership roles that she has held as a prominent theologian in the Philippines. I now invite Dr. Brazal to lead our discussion.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our audience from different parts of the world. Welcome to day one of our webinar. Before we begin, we wish to remind you of the following. This webinar is being recorded and the captioned video will be posted to the event page on the Berkeley Center's website soon. You will receive an email with the captioned video when it becomes available. Secondly, certificates of participation will be delivered upon completion of both day 1 and 2 evaluations. For our program, we shall proceed as follows. After I give a brief background of the colonial context, we shall have the 4 paper presentations and at the end, the Q&A. Day 1 of our webinar is focused on rethinking the encounters from a post-colonial perspective. The tasks of post-colonial criticism include scrutinizing historical and biblical documents for their colonial entanglements, resurrecting or foregrounding suppressed voices such as that of dominated peasants and women, and interacting with and reflecting on hybridity, deterritorialization, and double or multiple identities resulting from these cultural encounters. The goal of our post-colonial criticism is to decolonize knowledge and praxis of Christianity. In my brief introductory lecture, I will focus on some highlights of Philippine Christianity as it developed in the colonial context, 333 years under the Spanish rule and 48 years under the US-American regime, with particular focus on resistance and accommodation, as this has been inspired by the Christian faith. The initial encounters. When I was in grade school, we have been taught that it was Ferdinand Magellan who discovered the Philippines. The islands, however, have been known to Chinese and Islamic traders even before the arrival of the Spanish colonialists. It was actually our ancestors who discovered Magellan and his crew on March 18, 1521, in an island near Homonhon, Eastern Samar, extremely hungry, sick with scurvy, underfed, and dying. Our ancestors fed and gave them food supplies to last till they reached Maluku, which is now a part of Indonesia. Without their help, the Magellan-Elcano expedition would not have achieved its feat of circumnavigating the globe for the first time. On April 14, 1521, the first baptism was held in Cebu, where the chieftain Raha Humabon and his wife Hara Humamay were baptized together with 800 others. The story was traditionally romanticized, highlighting how the natives welcomed and accepted Christianity wholeheartedly. A more critical narrative reveals that Raha Humabon agreed to be baptized to cement his alliance with Magellan against Lapu-Lapu, the ruler of Mactan, with whom he has some enmity. The Colombian historian Martin Noon described the growing resentment against the Spaniards' demand for the people to convert, their intrusion into the people's life, and even their treatment of women. This would explode in the Battle of Mactan, where Lapu-Lapu galvanized the help of other chieftains. Jesuit historian Jose Arcilla noted how Magellan grossly underestimated his enemies, leading to the defeat of the Spaniards and his untimely demise. The first bishop and synod. 44 years later, in 1565, the Spanish conquistadores returned and established the first permanent settlement in Cebu. Domingo de Salazar, hailed as the De las Casas of the Philippines, arrived 16 years later in 1581 as the first bishop of Manila. Like Bartolome de las Casas, he championed the rights of the indigenous populations. Informed by the natives themselves of the atrocities being committed, de Salazar described in his 1582 letter to the King of Spain the Spanish colonies' abuse of the indigenous population and the Chinese migrants in the islands. He pleaded for the reform of the encomienda system, which has become a means for the cruel and violent collection of tributes, while failing to protect and evangelize the natives. De Salazar also complained that the rule against Spanish ownership of slaves was not being enforced, and thus the people resisted conversion and were more receptive of Islamic preachers from Mindanao and Borneo. Within only a year of his arrival in the country, the bishop convened the Synod of Manila that addressed the issue of forced labor, confiscation of land, as well as determined the cases in which restitution had to be made and how much. All this was set down in a handbook for confessors. The 1582 Synod of Manila laid a strong moral foundation for the new colony, at least in principle, holding the conquistadores accountable to help win the trust of the locals. The clash with the Babaylands. The early history of evangelization in the islands is characterized by a clash on the one hand between the indigenous religions led by the shamans called Babaylan or Catalonan, who are mostly older women with a few transgender female, and on the other hand, Christianity headed by an all-male priesthood. At the start of the 17th century, it is estimated that over half of the Philippines had heard the gospel, and 1/3 had been baptized. But Christianity had not really taken deep roots. the people continued to go to the priestess for all their problems. The conversion of the native shamans was important to ensure the evangelization of the islands. The Spanish priests condemned the shamans as priestesses of the devil. In accordance with the instructions to commissary of the Inquisition in the Philippines, young boys were removed from their families to live in a convent where they received catechism and baptism, and then employed to catechize the older generation, or if not, report their clandestine animist practices. The Babaylan tradition, however, was not completely eradicated. Indigenous religions and beliefs will merge with Christian beliefs to galvanize resistance against colonizers. The revolutionary impact of religious ideas. While the national elites were influenced by liberal ideals from Europe, the masses drew their inspiration for the revolution in their hybrid religiosity. The post-colonial theorist Homi Bhabha developed the concept of hybridity in relation to the construction of culture and identity in the colonial context. The colonial government hoped to reproduce in the colonized their culture, but failed by producing instead a hybrid, an in-between. Hybridity is a product in the context of unequal power relations of both accommodation and resistance to colonial domination. For instance, Reynaldo Ileto in his book Passion and Revolution argued how the masses were inspired to resist colonial domination through the ritual singing of the Passion in the latter period of Spanish colonization in the 19th century. As powerful amulets are believed to emit light and make their possessors radiant, Christ himself has been described in the Passion as radiating with light. The peasants believed that only a person with a beautiful loob or inner self that attracts others can be a light to others. Aligned with this, the revolutionary 19th century Katipunan movement, which fought against the Spanish colonizers, has been imaged like Christ of the Passion, as radiating with light that leads to liberation. Jesuit historian John Schumacher also highlighted as major influence on the masses the Filipino clergy who were favorable to the revolution. Quote, where the clergy gave their support and leadership, the masses remained faithful to the revolution, unquote. In fact, the most crucial event that led to the revolution against Spanish rule was the execution of 3 Filipino secular priests in 1872, allegedly for their involvement in a Cavite military mutiny. They were leaders for the secularization, in effect, nationalization of Philippine parishes. The radicalization of the nationalist movement among the clergy, however, eventually took form in the establishment in 1902, already during the US-American regime, of the Iglesia Filipiniana Independiente, or the IFI. The IFI had as its dual aim the liberation from the influence of foreign regular clergy and the establishment of a church with a Filipino face. A number of Protestant missionaries who arrived with the US colonialists defended, or at the very least, spoke well of the IFI, hoping they could eventually get converts from them. Within the Catholic Church, however, it was only in 1919 that the Church, through Pope Benedict XV, advocated for the thorough training of the native clergy, as they can better understand their people and thus able to more effectively introduce the faith to them. Albeit usually long delayed, the Church continues to change in response to stirrings from below or the peripheries. I hope that our brief highlights of some important phases in the development of Christianity in the Philippines during the colonial period have provided you with a bird's eye view of both processes of resistance and accommodation, as well as the hybridities resulting from the colonial encounters. From our speakers, we shall hear more of what happened during these encounters and their consequences, implications, or challenges for us today. Our first speaker is an expert on the subject of Muslim movements, Muslim women, visual expressions of Islam, and Islam in the Philippines and Southeast Asia, and was an associate professor at the De La Salle University, Philadelphia. You will find the rest of her brief bio in the chat box. Let us all welcome Dr. Vivian Angeles, who will present to us her paper, Christianity and Islam in the Philippines.
Thank you very much, Dr. Agnes Brazal. Okay, the title of my paper is Rethinking Encounters and Reimagining Christian-Muslim Relations in Post-Colonial Philippines. In the 500 years since the Spanish landed in the Philippines in 1521, relations between Muslims and Christians have been very much influenced by government policies. In this situation, the political authorities, the Spanish and American colonial governments, and the post-colonial Philippine government functioned as arbiters of Muslim-Christian relations. My presentation will touch on Islam in pre-colonial Philippines and Christianity as a colonial export, the colonial policies affecting Muslim-Christian relations, post-colonial policies affecting Muslim-Christian relations, and the efforts of Christians and Muslims at interreligious understanding in contemporary times. Scholars estimate that there were already Muslim settlements in Sulu in the last quarter of the 13th century, almost 200 years before the Spaniards stumbled upon the Philippines in 1521. Although on the fringes of the Islamic world centered in Saudi Arabia, the Philippine South was very much a part of the trade zone, where Arabs, Chinese, and other nationals traded goods and services for the global markets at the time. Arab traders also functioned as missionaries and were responsible to a great extent for the spread of Islam in the Philippines. This was part of the developments in Islam in the Malay region. Islam was not confined to Sulu and Mindanao. Testimonies of friar missionaries around 1580 mentioned that by the time the Spanish arrived in Manila, they had found Muslim chiefs like Raja Suliman, who were related to the ruling families of Borneo and Brunei. Historical records also inform us that Islam was the official religion of the Sulu Sultanate, with the Sultan acting as both the political and religious head, who carried the title of the shadow of God on earth, Zilallah fil Ard. As a religious head, he had the right to appoint the officials of the mosque. He had the right to have his name mentioned at the Friday prayer. And he also was considered the protector of the Sharia and ruled on the guidance of a Qadi, a judge who usually was a Malay or an Arab Muslim. There were other sultans who reigned in different parts of Mindanao, and considering the presence of Islam and Muslims in Manila and Bataan, Antonio de Morga, in his Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas, noted that if Spain had delayed their arrival, the Philippines would have been predominantly a Muslim country. Christianity, on the other hand, was a colonial export. For the Spanish colonizers, Christianity was the only legitimate religion, and they equated it with civilization. With the Spanish establishment of colonial rule, the social structure depended to a great extent on religious affiliation, with the Filipino Christians at the bottom of the social structure and the Muslims outside of it. Considering the insular nature of the country, where usually the missionaries were the ones willing to venture to remote regions, the dual duties of converting people and administering the pueblo then fell into the hands of members of religious orders like Dominicans, Jesuits, and Franciscans. Specific colonial government's policies towards the Muslims were embodied in several instructions to the king and Spanish officials. King Philip directed the colonists to reduce the Indians and convert them willingly to our Catholic faith and the Christian religion by means of religion and other good men. By 1577, Christianization of the indigenous peoples in Luzon and Visayas had progressed, so that King Philip decided that evangelization of the country was sufficiently advanced to merit the establishment of an episcopal see in Manila. However, the situation in southern Philippines was different. After attacking Brunei in 1579, Governor Sande instructed Esteban Rodriguez de Figueroa to proceed from Borneo to Jolo and Mindanao to pursue several objectives, which included converting the natives to Christianity, ordering the natives to refrain from admitting more Muslim preachers, since, and I quote, the teachings of Muhammad are evil and false, and that alone of the Christian is good. Muslim preachers were to be seized and the mosque burned and destroyed. The Spanish attempts at converting the Muslims in Mindanao and Sulu were complicated by what Muslims saw as intrusions into their commercial activities in the Sulu zone, of which the Sultan of Sulu was a major participant. Although Figueroa met very limited success, with the natives moving up to the hinterland instead of getting converted, Sande's instructions to him guided the Spanish in their relationship with Muslims in the succeeding centuries. When organized armed resistance by Muslims against Spain failed and against Spanish colonial policies, the responsibility then fell upon individuals who took it upon themselves to protest colonial policies by engaging in parang sabil, a form of ritual suicide, sacralized by actions that involve praying with the imam, reading passages from the Quran, being primed for attack, which included the use of white clothing, and early the next day striking in public places, killing random people that may include soldiers, non-Muslims, and also Muslims. Although the Quran prohibits suicide, several parang sabil happened in the course of Spanish and American colonization as a form of individual resistance against colonial practices. Also referred to as juramentado, parang sabil strengthened the colonial views of Muslims as prone to violent action, and images of Muslims running amok with bladed weapons were ingrained in our consciousness as children, even us living in traditionally Christian areas who never even met Muslims. An event, however, that raised hopes of converting Muslims was the supposed conversion of Sultan Azimuddin. He acceded to the request of the Spanish King Philip that Christian missionaries be allowed to preach in Jolo, but his subjects opposed the ideas, thus contributing to the deterioration of the political situation in Sulu. This prompted Sultan Azimuddin to sail to Manila to seek the help of the Spanish authorities. And while in Manila, he asked to be baptized a Christian. And after due deliberation from Spanish officials and members of the religious hierarchy, he was baptized and given the name Don Fernando Azimuddin, Catholic Sultan of Jolo. Spain was interested in having a Christian sultan in the hope of facilitating the conquest of the area, but that was not to be. There was a strong mutual distrust and suspicion between the Spanish and the Sultan's followers, leading the Spanish authorities then to realize that Sultan Azimuddin never really abandoned Islam. While en route to Sulu, he was returned to Manila a prisoner. There's a whole lot of history about this, but due to time limitations, I'm not going to expand on that. To Spain, it was necessary to Christianize Muslims so that they would be loyal to the crown, a position that was enthusiastically supported by religious orders. But in the end, the Spaniards had, although they were able to establish some alliances with some sultans, the Spanish had to content themselves with leaving the Muslims to their fate. So the complex interplay of religion, commerce, and politics that also involved violent encounters made for the lack of missionary success in Mindanao and Sulu, despite heavy Jesuit missionary presence in the area. Negative descriptions of Muslims in colonial literature, which became the basis of early Philippine history books, together with representations of Muslims in a theater form called Comedia o Murmuro, reinforced the negative images of Muslims and left a legacy of mutual suspicions between Muslims and Christians that continued even during the present time. Religion also became a salient feature of identity of Philippines in the Philippines, and Muslims became the other in Philippine society. By the time the Philippines became a colony of the United States, Christianity, the Catholic version, had become the majority religion in the country, except in the South. Now, due to the lack of understanding about Islam and Muslims, the American administrators also relied on Spanish officials and members of religious orders and ruled the country through their Spanish views of Islam and Muslims. The United States did not officially support any move to convert Muslims to Christianity, but there were many indications of their preference for Christianity in their various colonial policies. Official records and personal writings of American administrators bear anti-Muslim sentiments and derogatory remarks. Religion, however, continued to be an identity marker as administrators created a separate bureau for Muslims and other indigenous peoples called the Bureau of Non-Christian Tribes. Different Christian missionaries came to the Philippines and to Mindanao during the American period. And while some experienced initial resistance from the locals, others achieved some measure of success dealing with Muslims and establishing Christian churches, like Frank Loback of the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, who established a school that welcomed Muslims and engaged them in discussions on Christianity and Islam. This may well be considered as an early attempt at interreligious understanding in Mindanao. The tension between the local populations in Mindanao and the Americans were at times high, resulting in armed confrontations. Because of the religious identity of the persons involved, the conflicts tended to be viewed basically as Muslim-Christian religious conflict, even they involved more complicated factors rather than just religious difference. By the time the Philippine independent government was established in 1946, such negative views as defined by colonial governments had already become entrenched in the consciousness of both Philippine Christians and Muslims. The post-independent Philippine government continued some of the colonial practices and programs in Mindanao, while at the same time, the situation of the Muslims continued to lag behind in terms of economic indices of poverty, lower literacy rates, underdevelopment, and others. In 1969, the Muslims in the South and other non-Muslim sympathizers launched the Moro National Liberation Front and called for the creation of an Islamic State. The President Marcos cited this rebellion as one of the reasons why he declared martial law in 1972. The wars during that time caused the death, destruction, and displacement of people as the Philippine military and the Moro National Liberation Front engaged in armed confrontations in various parts of Mindanao and Sulu. The Philippine government then had to address both the situations of the Muslims and the demands of the Liberation Front. And so the government of Marcos implemented not only social and economic programs but also policies that were conducive to the practice of Islam, like the declaration in 1973 that Islam is part of Filipino heritage. This included the preservation and enhancement of Islamic tradition and the promotion of the well-being of Muslim communities. Now, over and against the Spanish heritage of religious intolerance, and while priding itself as the only Catholic country in Asia, the Philippine government now sought to give Islam a rightful place in a predominantly Christian nation, with presidential decrees recognizing Muslim holidays, a regulation of work during Ramadan, creation of a money bank, codification of Muslim laws, And not just that, but also not just the reconstruction of mosque damaged during the war, but also the building of a mosque at the heart of Manila on government service insurance system property, and also in the Maharlika village. The government referred to these as cultural centers, claiming that Muslims are cultural minorities who happen to be Muslims and therefore deserve government support. There was the issue of the separation of church and state, but there was no organized opposition. And besides, it was martial law. Who could oppose? Okay. So the government programs and policies, while intended to rectify previous anti-Muslim biases and discrimination of Muslims, also provided an environment conducive to Islamic resurgence in the country. Now, as I tried to show in my paper, the government through the centuries set the tone for Muslim-Christian relations through its policies and programs. However, presidential decrees and legislation do not guarantee the removal of age-old perception. Now, the Catholic Church, on the other hand, as an institution, has various programs for interreligious understanding, not to mention the Nostra Aetate document of Vatican II. But my random interviews of Filipino Catholics inform me that they are unaware of church efforts and have no clue about Nostra Aetate or the programs in the Vatican about promoting Muslim-Christian understanding. In contemporary times, various groups like the World Council of Churches, the Bishop Ulama Conference, Philippine Council for Islam and Democracy, Mothers for Peace, as well as other NGOs, have initiated programs and projects allowing Muslims and Christians to work together. Although Christians and Muslims are exercising their agency in the attempt at interreligious understanding and promoting peace, these efforts need to be expanded to reach more people at the grassroots levels, because we're at the grassroots level where there are still those who view Muslims or Christians in terms of colonial assessments. Hopefully, the interreligious initiatives will provide more interaction between Muslims and Christians in an atmosphere of religious pluralism, which calls for engaging each other's shared ideas while respecting each other's differences. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Vivian, for your elucidation about the encounter of Islam and Christianity, the othering of Islam, and attempts of government and church towards interreligious understanding. If you have questions to Dr. Vivian, you can post them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and please write the country where you are based, and yes, it's addressed to Dr. Vivian. Okay, our second speaker is currently the Vincentian Chair of Social Justice in St. John's University, New York, and his book, Back to the Rough Grounds of Praxis, Exploring Theological Method with Pierre Bourdieu, was awarded the Jan and Marie Huys Prize of the Leuven Academic Foundation as Best Research in the Humanities in 2003. You will find the rest of his brief bio in the chat box. Let us all welcome Reverend Dr. Daniel Franklin Pilario, who will present to us his paper, The Advent of Christianity, the Double Truth of Mission.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bresal, for the kind words of introduction, and thank you for inviting me into this conference. We know that the past is not past. Its ghosts continue to haunt us. Edward Said writes, appeals to the past are among the commonest strategies in the interpretation of the present. So the debate is not only about what the past is, for example, whether martial law was a golden age of the Philippine history or not, but also if the past is really past. So for example, whether the sins of Marcos Sr. can be imputed to Marcos Jr. The debate, therefore, is not only about the past, it's also about the post. But this paper is not about Marcos. It is about how to understand Spanish colonial evangelization and its implications to post-colonial missiology. To start, let me mention two general directions on how to read the Spanish colonial missions. On the one hand, you have the Hispanophiles, who, for the love of Spain, shower wholehearted praise to the Spanish efforts. One example is the church historian Pablo Fernandez. He was my revered professor in church history, and his book, Church History in the Philippines, has become a classic in many seminaries. The main blurb of the book says, Christianity brought civilized ways, salvation, and unity to the island. It was able, at the cost of so much sacrifice, to keep the Filipinos for Christ and for Spain. On the other hand, you have the nationalists. Renato Constantino's classic work, Philippines, a Past Revisited, more or less of the same time, certainly is a reference book to many history students and was hailed as the new interpretation of Philippine history, at least at that time. He argues that the church's role was transformed from a mere colonial accessory to a principal apparatus of colonial exploitation. Of course, since history is not black and white, there are different shades of gray in between these two extremes. The Jesuit historian Horacio de la Costa narrates that in many colonial documents, it is written El Servicio de Ambas Majestades, in the service of both majesties. To quote, he says, in the constitution of the Spanish Empire, each served both majesties, God and King. Church and state might be distinct, but they were integral parts of one massive structure, which might be viewed either as a civilizing church or a missionary state. What proves useful to my project here is Pierre Bourdieu's post-structuralist notion of double truth. The French sociologist Bourdieu thinks that practice is both a structured structure and structuring structure. On the one hand, it is both a product of the social structures of which it is a part, including its abuses and asymmetries. And on the other hand, it also contains ingenious and creative elements being part of creative human practice. Double truth, therefore, pervades the whole of Bourdieu's sociological studies. One example is his analysis of gift exchange. In the 1920s, the anthropologist Marcel Mauss wrote the now classic research on the gift. For Mauss, gift exchange exercises some sort of magical effect on early societies. People do not only give, they also have to give in return, thus cementing the whole society into an organic whole. In what the structuralist Claude Lévi-Strauss later would call the generous cycles of reciprocity. But beyond them, Bourdieu argues that gift exchange is not only generous exchange, it is also power-laden. First, in these societies, a giver can lavish gifts on someone that makes it impossible to reciprocate. Refer to the Filipino notion of utang na loob. Second, people actually hide the real economic intents of gifts. For example, we ask, why do you take out the price tag when you give a gift? Bourdieu calls this symbolic violence. Let us apply this to my initial problematic. On the one hand, since colonial mission was obvious product of colonial arrangement, it also exercises symbolic violence and sometimes overt violence as forced labor, slavery, onerous taxation, and others. On the other hand, the real practices of agents on the ground also contain creative resources within the bounds of their own historical limits. We can summon many historical researches to demonstrate my point. First is the one mentioned by Dr. Brazal earlier, Reynaldo Ileto's research on Passion and Revolution. On the one hand, the singing of the Passion can be viewed as colonial instrument to inculcate resignation in the midst of oppression, emulating the silence of Jesus being led to the cross. On the other hand, Ileto argues that Passion had also provided the revolutionaries a rallying symbol for the revolution. In short, it contains a double truth, which was ingeniously utilized to foster solidarity among the oppressed, to give a language and vision for an alternative world far from what the colonizers have ever imagined. But the other example is the question of justice and human rights during the colonial era. Bourdieu can easily agree with Renato Constantino. Constantino's main argument is actually this, that the conquest is business. Evangelization was a mere religious garb to mask Spain's economic interests. If there were infighting between the friars and the encomenderos, it was a battle on who gets the greater spoils of the conquest. In Bourdieu's frame, this is precisely what symbolic violence means: economic interests masquerading as generous giftedness of faith and civilization. But if Constantino's structuralist and Marxist reading is the only interpretation, it cannot account for other real experiences that also form part of colonial history on the ground. For example, it cannot account for the role of the Dominican Domingo de Salazar, the first bishop of Manila, and his lifetime fight for the human rights of the colonized natives. De Salazar came from the school of Salamanca, whose famous theologians Francisco de Vitoria and Francisco Suarez advocated for the natural rights of indigenous peoples long before the modern discussion on human rights today. Montesinos and Bartolome de las Casas, the protectors of indigenous people of the Americas, also came from this same school. From the time Domingo de Salazar first stepped into the Philippine soil to the time of his death, the bishop defended the rights of the Filipinos against slavery, extortion of tribute, etc. And after a long fight with colonial rulers in the Philippines, he went back to Spain in 1591 to put his lifetime advocacy in front of the king. But earlier than Salazar, the first Augustinian friars, for example, Fray Andres de Ordaneta, who came with Legazpi in 1565, were already opposed to the conquest of the Philippines. In front of the king, the representative Fray Martin de Rada categorically stated, and I quote, "I have taken all the opinions of the fathers who were to be found here. They unanimously affirm that none among these islands have come into the power of the Spaniards with just title." These narratives and more do not feature in the Marxist structuralist radar of Renato Constantino, just as he dismisses the propaganda movement of Rizal, Marcelo H. del Pilar, and others as reformist and elitist, or the revolution of the masses inspired by the Passion as magical. There is a thin line that divides between the Hispanophiles and the nationalists. while the Hispanophiles viewed colonial evangelization as liberation of the Filipino from the power of the devil, which is a ridiculous narrative, the nationalist versions also reject other legitimate revolutionary voices that do not fit into their straitjacket. Let me mention, and this is the last part, let me mention some implications this analysis has to the future of missiology. Number one, gifted to give. From Bourdieu's perspective of the gift, the motto gifted to give, chosen by the CBCP for the 500-year celebration, becomes naively problematic. The double truth paradigm necessitates an analytic of power to assess the complex evangelization efforts of Christianity, not only during the Spanish times, but also in subsequent centuries. These should lead us to examine how the church, yesterday and today, exercises its hegemonic power over indigenous peoples, Muslims, and other Christian groups, women and other genders and other faiths. Number two, double truth of mission. On the one hand, there were episodes of abuse and violence and exploitation brought about by the church's collusion with imperial power. On the other hand, we should not delete from our narratives the creative and transformative actions, both of individual missionaries, individual Christians, and church structures. In an earlier article, I have outlined interesting lessons on enculturation, fight for justice, creative integral evangelization done by the Spanish missionaries. The ambivalences tell us that all practices are complex, and there is a need to bring the analysis to actual contexts on the rough grounds. Beyond that, the theory of double truth also leads us to history's surplus of meaning, to borrow a phrase from Gadamer and Ricoeur, or if you want to use a Christian and religious language, the presence of grace despite human sinfulness. Third and last, the way of Jesus and his mission. Then and now, the historical abuses are connected with the church's collusion with power and its refusal to follow the way of the poor man of Nazareth. Without that fidelity, mission can present itself as a civilizing action to savage others or saving pagan souls and conquering the world for Christ. Like the empire, mission became an exercise of power, an act of self-preservation and destruction of other cultures. But the same history of missiology also brings out other alternatives and reflexive models: enculturation, liberation, dialogue, witness, and option for the victim and martyrdom. Beyond missio agentes, which is the CBCP byword for the 500 years of celebration, Asian theologians already talked of missio intergentes, a decisive move from power to witness, from planting churches to dialogical ecclesiologies. Thank you and good evening. Good morning.
Thank you, Father Danny, for your elaboration on the double truth or ambivalence of mission, or how Christianity has accomplished great things during the colonial period while being itself a principal apparatus of colonial appropriation and exploitation. If you have questions to our speakers, you can post them in the Q&A box. Our third speaker is an associate professor at the Department of Theology and Religious Education, De La Salle University, Manila, whose postdoctoral research focused on new hermeneutics for renewed dialogues, a Catholic perspective on crucial theological issues in the Jewish-Christian and ecumenical dialogues in the perspective of a future-oriented interpretation of key Johannine texts. You will find the rest of our brief bio in the chat box. Let us all welcome Dr. Ma Marilu Ibita, who will present her paper, Passion and Biblical Anti-Judaism, a Post-Colonial Overview. Because of possible internet connectivity issues in the Philippines, Dr. Ibita has opted to present a recording of her talk, but will be present for the Q&A.
My topic today is Passion and Biblical Anti-Judaism, a Post-Colonial Overview. If you're a Filipino, most likely you have heard the reproach, Hudyo ka ba? Or ano ka Hudyo? What are you, a Jew? You hear this reproach when you do many activities, or if you play, or if you are noisy and rowdy during the Holy Week, especially on Holy Thursday, Good Friday, and Black Saturday. Where does this come from? I posit that this caricature of the Hudyo is a remnant of the characterization that one finds in the Passion based on stories from the Bible and beyond. Yet this caricature in Filipino Catholics' consciousness needs to be critically assessed towards a more active form of constructing Christian identity and strengthening one's commitment to solidarity in a plural world. The Passion is very rich and complex. I will only give a few points for this post-colonial reflection in view of the global presence of the Filipino Catholics, including in Israel, where about 25,000 Filipinos are working, and other places where many Jews and Filipinos live, even if there are very few Jewish people in the Philippines today. My presentation will have focus on the characterization of the Jews in the Passion, and I will conclude with some challenges for the global Filipinos in view of identity formation and solidarity promotion. 2. Characterization of the Hudyo in the Passion and Biblical Anti-Judaism. Rene Haveliana describes the Passion as, I quote, the generic term for a type of religious verse that narrates the life of Jesus Christ the Savior. He says that the chant usually consists of 8 syllables in 5 lines that includes short sermonette of a doctrinal or moral nature which seek to explain or apply a particular episode or saying of Jesus' life to the life of the reader. The Passions are not only narrative but also didactic verses. This presentation focuses on the presently available reprint version by Luna and Sons entitled Awit at Salaysay ng Pasyong Mahal na Jesucristong Panginoon natin, sukat ipag-alab ng puso ng sinumang babasa, or the so-called Passion Pilapil. This is based on the 1854 version as shown in the title page in the picture below. Haveliana's study of the Passion genealogy shows that the Passion is found in Ilocano, Pangasinan, Ibanag, Pampango, Samareño, Bicol, Hiligaynon, and Cebuano, but the earliest is the Tagalog version, Mahal na Pasyon ni Jesucristong Panginoon natin na tula, written by Gaspar Aquino de Belen. The oldest extant copy is only the 5th edition in 1760. In Haveliana's genealogy, the Passion Pilapil is a descendant. This retelling of the story of salvation begins with the Genesis creation account and Paul's story, a conflated Gospels account of the life of Jesus from conception up to his last judgment from the perspective of the Apocalypse of John, and up to the discovery of his cross and the crucifixion nails by Empress Helena. This most popular version, and at times the only known version in rural areas, is also the basis of the Cenaculo, the theatrical presentation of Christ's Passion. The Passion, as pabasa, is usually chanted uninterrupted all day and all night in front of an image or statue of the suffering Christ during the Holy Week by those who made vows to do so. Despite being the most popular, Rafael Ileto recognizes that the Passion Pilapil is a highly imperfect composition, one that probably does not deserve much attention from a literary or theological standpoint. However, he also said that it stands out mainly as, to paraphrase Mark Bloch, a mirror of the collective consciousness. The Passion Pilapil was, for all purposes, the social epic of the 19th century Tagalogs and probably other lowland groups as well. Thus, we are using this now to theologize and to reflect on the 500 years of Christianity and the global Filipino-Filipina post-colonial perspectives. From a post-colonial view, Ileto contends that the Passion has a vital role in forming the poor and uneducated segment of the Filipinos to revolt against Spain. He wrote, they became popular precisely because leaders were able to tap existing notions of change. The Passion was freed from its officially sanctioned moorings in Holy Week and allowed to give form and meaning to the people's struggle for liberation. The character of Jesus inspired and formed people towards liberation. He was raised from the dead after suffering torture and death in the hands of the Jews. This paper will focus on the depiction of the Jews or the Hudyo as the antagonist. Before characterizing the Hudyo in the Passion, it is important to recall that the larger historical context includes the end of the Reconquista, being followed by colonization, and the growing anti-Jewish sentiment leading to the expulsion of the Jews in Spain. The negative sentiments expressed in political and sociocultural means did not go away. It is vital to note that lay Philippine Catholics in the 18th and 19th century Counter-Reformation era did not have direct access to the Bible. Biblical stories, particularly those about Jesus, were taught in catechesis, preached in sermons and homilies, and heard by the people in the reading of the Liturgy of the Word during the weekly celebration of the Eucharist and the chanting of the Passion during the Lenten season. Passion scholars are still studying the sources of the Passion, most likely the Old Testament and the New Testament, or paraphrase, other religious literature, devotionals, artworks, and others. The Bible was only translated into the vernacular in the 1930s. Focusing on the Hudyo in the Passion, the first reference is found in the section around Jesus' conception in the citation of hailing the Jewish nation with its monotheistic faith. The Magi also came to worship the king of the Hudyo, as Matthew attests. Likewise, Hudyo is recalled as a group celebrating the Passover, recalling the liberation from Egypt. This feast is the reason for Jesus' pilgrimage and entry to Jerusalem. This positive or at least neutral presentation of the Jews in the Passion reflect the biblical text. Now, concerning the negative presentation of the Hudyo in the Passion, as far as the sources of the Passion are concerned, we acknowledge that there are indeed passages in the New Testament, especially the Passion narratives, that reflect anti-Judaism, and they have been interpreted or artistically expressed in this manner, nurturing negative sentiments against the Jews. Anti-Judaism is a more general term encompassing any discrimination of Jews, whether it is based on a theory of race or any other criteria. Today, it is fomented by anti-Semitism, a hostility toward or discrimination against Jews as a religious or racial group from a 19th century race theory invention which had not existed at the time of the New Testament writing. So how does the negative portrayal of Hudyo happen in the Passion? First, it happens by subsuming all the antagonists into the character of the Hudyo. While the biblical accounts make a clear differentiation about the roles of the different characters in the Passion narrative, particularly the Jews, the Passion's presentation subsumes the different Jewish groups, the Pharisees, the scribes, the priests, the crowd, and non-Jewish groups, like the soldiers, regardless of race and religions, under the character of the Hudyo, as you can see in this citation. Second, the negative portrayal also happens by amplifying the Hudyo's primary role in the suffering and death of Jesus. It is emphasized in the conflation of the Passion accounts. The titles of the Passion sections in the Passion display this emphasis. These include the Jews bringing Jesus to Annas and to Caiaphas, the Jews taunting of Jesus, the Jews crowning of Jesus with thorns, the Jews' command to break the crucified's leg, and the Jews' command to guard the tomb. For example, take a look at the citation taken from the section of the crowning of Jesus with thorns. It includes the physical assault to Jesus, the stripping of his clothes, the crowning itself, and the taunting of Jesus. They are described as done by the Jews, but they were done by the soldiers according to Mark 15, Matthew 27, and even the section on his crucifixion and death in the Passion is described as carried out by the Jews, including the mention of Hebrews in 1541 and the Pharisees in 1546, and totally lacking reference sold in 155, 1-7. Third, the use of negative adjectives. The Jews are taken collectively with the use of tanan, madla, lahat. Many adjectives used are not from the biblical text, such as hunghang or absurd, ganid or savage, and malupit, cruel. The use of synonymous intensifying adjectives for traitor to describe the Jews and as a reference to them is remarkable. They are taksil, buhong, sukaban, kohila. The most numerous is the adjective lilo with 56. The adjective lilo can be translated as harsh and merciless, ungrateful, traitorous, or perfidious. The passion also becomes more explicit when lilo is combined with hudyo, lilong hudyo. Lilo is first mentioned in connection with the snake as devil in Genesis 3, with Cain when he killed his brother. It is also used for Herod's killing of the innocent and Judas's betrayal. Lilong hudyo is mentioned 11 times. The observable multiple usages of lilo and the other synonyms for traitor reflect the many use of prodotis and paradidomi in the Gospels, particularly in relation to Jesus' being betrayed. The use of this traitor-betrayer theme in the Passion is intensified through the employment of the synonymous intensifying adjectives. Moreover, there is an intensification of the negative presentation of the Jews with a link between lilo and the devil. It recalls John 8:44 when, in his intense debate with the Jews, Jesus said, "You are of your father the devil, and your will is to do your father's desires." The Passion verse shown here reflect the Johannine verse, but the Passion context is Matthew's scene of Pilate's verdict. It can potentially foment anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. Here is another example of a demonization of the savage, traitorous Jews in the context of Jesus being mobbed after Pilate's verdict. This is not found in any of the Gospel Passion narratives. In a nutshell, we have seen that Jesus in the Passion invited people towards liberation, but the negative portrayal of the antagonist Hudyo have been influenced by the sociocultural political context of the time and the anti-Judaism in the conflated Passion narratives and the other sources of the Passion. This is communicated in three ways. First, by subsuming all those against him under the term Judyo, regardless of the differentiation among the different Jewish groups like the priests, scribes, Pharisees, and the crowd, and despite the difference in race and religion, like the Roman soldiers. By emphasizing their primary role in Jesus' torture and killing, and the use of various negative adjectives, particularly that of being traitorous in intensifying manner, culminating into being associated with the devil. In this third part, I want to explore with you what's next. Given the negative portrayal of the Jews in the Passion, so what? Is this a global Filipino concern since there are still about 2,000 Jews in the Philippines, 25,000 Filipino contract workers in Israel, and many more in places where Jews and Filipinos are found globally? Perhaps some will say, no, carry on. The Passion was used since 1900s. We welcomed the Jews fleeing the Nazis and voted for the State of Israel. There are no cases of anti-Semitic violence in the Philippines. There is no need to do anything with it. Others might think that, yes, but it's high time to cancel it. Given the anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism influence, it's politically and theologically wrong. Or shall we take the challenges of the teachable moment with impact on our identity formation through interreligious dialogue and solidarity promotion? This will mean embarking on additional critical faith education and theologizing with regards to our Christian identity in relation with the Jews, bearing in mind the teaching of Nostra Aetate 4 that what happened in his passion cannot be charged against all the Jews without distinction, then alive, nor against the Jews of today. We have to re-energize implementing the notes from the Vatican offices on interreligious dialogue and religious education with insights from the Pontifical Biblical Commission, such as the suggestions in this document, the Jewish people and their sacred scriptures in the Christian Bible. The challenges will also include stepping up in the practice of interreligious dialogue for solidarity, dialogue of life in the common spaces, dialogue of action to stop racial and religion-based hate for the Jews, Filipinos and other Asians and other races, theological dialogue in communities and theological schools, and dialogue of religious experience, especially because the Holy Week and Passover overlap once again this year. It's time to rewrite the Passion. We can also link these actions to human rights and UNSDG promotion. I look forward to the conversations and our common actions. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you, Dr. Malu, for the paper and the challenge that you left us. What to do now with the Passion, which has been in use since the 19th century, instrumental in inspiring the masses in the Revolution for Independence, but deeply tainted as it is with anti-Judaism. If you have questions to our speakers, please post them in the Q&A box. Our fourth speaker is an anthropologist and a National Book Awardee who is currently teaching at the Pontifical Gregorian University, Rome. He had worked as director of various social centers and has championed the causes of women, indigenous peoples, and Muslims in the Philippines. You will find the rest of his brief bio in the chat box. Let us welcome Reverend Dr. Albert Alejo, who will present to us his paper, Should a Roman Catholic Church Say Sorry? Reflections on John Paul II's prayer of pardon in relation to the indigenous peoples in the Philippines.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Agnes, and the organizers of this conference. Sorry, it's 2 a.m. here in Rome. I'm in the library, not because I like these books, old books, but just to avoid disturbing my neighbors. I asked the question, should the Catholic Church in the Philippines say sorry? Also, why also? Because in year 2000, Pope John Paul II, now saint, had a prayer which said, Lord, sorry. Christians have often denied the gospel, yielding to a mentality of power. They have violated, it should be we, they have violated the rights of ethnic groups and peoples and shown contempt for their culture and religious traditions. So Lord, be patient and merciful toward us and grant us your forgiveness. That was March 12, 2000. But even before that, some religious groups have already said sorry. They have apologized. For example, the Oblates in Canada declared publicly, we apologize for the part we played in the cultural, ethnic, linguistic, and religious imperialism. That was part of the mentality. So that's the mentality within which the peoples of Europe first met the Aboriginal peoples, and which consistently has lurked behind the way the native peoples of Canada have been treated. And we were naively part of this mentality of power. We allowed ourselves to be instruments of this religious, linguistic, ethnic imperialism. The Anglicans of Canada also, represented, for example, by Archbishop Michael Pierce, said, I have felt shame and humiliation. That's a strong version of apology, as I have heard of suffering inflicted by my people, especially in terms of the hidden peoples, the hidden generations. Recently, they discovered new data about this hidden generation. And he said, I accept and I confess before God and you our failures in the residential schools. We failed you, we failed ourselves, and we failed God. Now, our Jesuit document is not that explicit, but it says, we have an intuition that every culture has this goodness within, but at the same time, we acknowledge that we have not always followed that intuition. As a matter of fact, we have contributed to the alienation of the very people we wanted to serve. The Franciscans said sorry to the Mayan people in Yucatan, 2009. We ask forgiveness of the Mayan people for not having understood your worldview and your religion, and for demonizing your religious practices. It's a case of imposing a religion which you don't understand and dismissing a religion which we fail to understand. So it's kind of in that context that there was some kind of a pressure on the bishops in the Philippines to also consider asking for forgiveness. 10 years after the prayer of John Paul II, we had a workshop, and I was the facilitator of this. I was one of the facilitators. And that's why I'm sharing this, not a quotation from any text, but from the experience. Immediately, when we were discussing, just orienting some 60 bishops who joined the workshop, many questions arose. For example, wait a minute, who are the IPs, by the way? So many bishops would like to get some definition of the IPs. So how can we say sorry if we don't even know who the IPs were? So how many are Catholics? Can we judge previous missionary approaches according to our present missiological categories? They should listen to the talk of Danny Pilario. The Indigenous Peoples Apostolate as part of social action. So what's there's a tension between the social action part, advocacy, no baptism, and the pastoral work of the parishes, which wanted to baptize the IPs. Metro Manila. In other words, the question of should we say sorry is happening now. Although the question is historical, the impact of the question is felt at present. No. Now, and for example, Metro Manila, where are the IPs? And how can the bishops of Metro Manila say sorry? Where are they? So because of those initial reactions, we had to reframe our workshop process. So I said, maybe we can use 3 R's. One, what can we reaffirm? What do we regret as having happened? And what are we ready to do in terms of the new direction of evangelization, reconciliation, formation program, advocacy, and political action? And the summary of the workshop results. Number 1, reaffirmation, reaffirm. The bishop said, we reaffirm the work and the witness, and to some extent, especially in the beginning, the scholarship of the missionaries. We owe to these missionaries the existing dictionaries. No? Sila yung merong record. Pastoral work of some dioceses with IPs, humanitarian work in terms of during disasters and even wars. Overt preaching is we reaffirm involvement in the education of IPs, including scholarships, shared belief in God, collaboration with the laity and NGOs, and cultural preservation. But the bishops also expressed regret that along the way, many things happened which we are ashamed and embarrassed at the moment. For example, after so many years, decades, and even centuries, many priests and missionaries, theologians, they don't even bother. There's lack of understanding, there's distance, social, cultural distancing, and the destruction of writing and other cultural treasures, discriminatory practices, punishing those who speak the vernacular, failure to stress the social teachings of the church, lack of coordination among the pastoral work, the educational work, and the indigenous people's ministry. So while some groups are advocating for the rights of the indigenous peoples, the Catholic educational institutions continue the discrimination through the curriculum, etc. Of course, the acquisition of land, cemeteries that became cemeteries or church properties, and paternalism and dole-outs, cultural exploitation. Now, they said, okay, now we know that we're ready to revise our catechesis and evangelization, established IP desks, empowering IP works, institutional and financial support for IP ministries, integral evangelization, etc. Now, so in other words, it's asking the question, should we say sorry, is complex, as Danny Pilar would say. No, it's complex. Who are the IPs and who are the we? If, for example, the early missionaries committed blunders and abuses, why should we now say sorry? And how can we say sorry now that we are fighting other enemies like mining companies and politicians? If we say sorry, we were criminals against the IPs, then who will benefit from that kind of sorry? And how do we know we are forgiven? To whom should we present our sorry, and should we return the lands? So it's really complicated. And who is demanding that we say sorry? We're ready to draft a pastoral letter, but unfortunately it never came out. Now, a few months after that, we had another gathering in Cebu of the representatives of the Association of Major Religious Superiors. And during the time, Cardinal Vidal said the Mass, and he gave a long but a very powerful homily, and two parts I give here. He says, should we apologize? Well, he said, we must not apologize for sharing with them the gospel of Christ. But yes, we must apologize, ask forgiveness for not acting as Jesus did. So we should not apologize for preaching the gospel. We should apologize for not living out the gospel. We must not apologize for sharing them the fruits of development, but we must ask forgiveness for teaching them the ways of greed and selfishness that often comes with development. We must not apologize for making them members of the church. Yeah, but we must ask forgiveness for the abuses some of the leaders of the church may have inflicted on them, especially on the young and the women. We must ask forgiveness for teaching Christianity as an ideology instead of a call to relationship with God. From there, we said we need a lot more to reflect on. Theologically, we need a new understanding of salvation, incarnation, dialogue, God's action in nature, in society, and the role of inspiring missionaries. Philosophically, we need to accommodate new epistemologies, new ways of gathering truth from dreams, from ancestors, the healing of memories, historical continuation of colonialism and violence, anthropological, how do we interpret culture, and is the spirituality of the indigenous people simply culture, or is that religion? Pastoral, socio-political, economic concerns, land issues, internal divisions, and personal. Suppose you are assigned, you have an extra thing can you really tackle the climbing mountains, etc. The stamina. And I'd like to call on attention on the personal later also. So now, what is good is that there are very many things that are happening, rethinking of so many things. And so the Indigenous Peoples Ministry could be enriched. So instead of just saying sorry, maybe we need to act on many different platforms. And we benefit from the new understanding of the ecclesiology, of being church, synodality, a new understanding of culture, so hybridity and multiple religious affiliation, new view of evangelization and cultures, listening evangelizers, new direction of mission, new way of doing mission, proclamation, not just imposition, but an invitation, a sharing narratives, etc. And the dialogue. But here I would like to call attention to the distinction between religion and culture. For example, in the Jesuit documents, GC 34, there is a one chapter on interreligious dialogue, but it does not mention the indigenous peoples. So apparently, in the interreligious dialogue is dialogue among book religions, missionary religions. But where are the indigenous peoples? The indigenous peoples are placed in the chapter on inculturation. When I asked the Bishops' Ulama Conference, why don't you have the indigenous peoples buy lands? And I was told that the Muslim leaders do not want them. Why? Because the indigenous peoples do not have sacred books. They do not have scriptures and doctrine. So the absence of text, prior to the whole question of hermeneutics of text, the absence of a sacred book could actually be a source of a standard that can be discriminatory. Now, there are new indigenous movements and solidarity initiatives all over the world. The internet, information technology allows for small or minority identities to assert themselves through their websites. Peace and reconciliation movements are all over the place. And of course, the environmental movements where the indigenous peoples are normally included. So there is a call for integral ecology and ecological conversion, especially with Pope Francis's Laudato Si, which gives special mention on indigenous peoples. Now, I'd like to go towards the end by mentioning the Amazon Synod. The Amazon Synod hardly mentions apologies, but it has plenty of action words on how the church could be to serve as partners and companions in their struggle for integral ecology, for dignity, against discrimination, and for appreciation of their spirituality. The Pope highly praises the indigenous people's contribution to the sustainable ecology, and the diversity is a wealth that should be tapped. But I noticed that the issue of saying sorry is at least couched in a cute paragraph here. The church is included in this whole struggle of self-critique to unlearn many things, to learn new things, and to relearn abandoned ways of thinking in order to overcome any tendency toward colonizing models, this mentality of superimposing colonial powers on the rest of the world. These colonizing models that have caused harm in the past. So I think that is a kind of an echoing of the apologies. It is important for us to be aware of the power of neo-colonialism. So this is placed within the post-colonial discourse, which is present in our daily decisions, in lifestyle, and predominant model of development. So there is the question of development models. And I think this exploration, openness to post-colonial ideas of development is in a way an effective, not just affective mode of saying sorry. But I'd like to call attention to the role of the church leaders, the priests, even bishops, who come from indigenous communities. I think in this whole struggle of hybridity and the confusion of identities, the indigenous clergy, for example, the indigenous religious, could have a unique role in the search for the synthesis or balance between this missionary impulse and the respect for subsidiarity. And when I say this, I think of Bishop Claver, for example. I think in this time, we need to renew our listening ear to the voice of people like Bishop Claver. I've started a study of Bishop Claver, and I think we need to hear voices coming from, yes, from Bartolome de las Casas, Domingo Salazar, but more recently from the voice of Bishop Francisco Claver. So I'll end with this presentation, and I stand to be enriched by our conversation here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Father Albert, for your provocative title and presentation that pushes us to think of how Indigenous peoples can be evangelized without committing cultural violence. So we shall now open the floor for the Q&A portion. So if you wish to submit your question, please post it at the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom screen. We have already a number of questions in the Q&A box. So let's start with a question addressed to Dr. Vivian. Actually, there are two. So this is from an anonymous attendee. Thanks for the great
Is that the one from Lily Mendoza?
present. No, it's another one. You can respond to Lily Mendoza's question
okay.
later.
Okay.
But this is a question from an anonymous attendee.
Okay.
So for me, the tone and tenure look exonerating Islam and pouring out criticism on Christianity, standing on the platform of 21st century and events that took place 15th and 16th century. Taking the scenario on a global platform, how can an interreligious dialogue be possible in its true sense, except for the cosmetic reasons, knowing what exactly Islam is, which is being hijacked by political Islam? Examples: the Quran 49:9, Surah 3:151, Surah 2:191, Hadiths, and Bukhari. For a Catholic authority reference, let me quote Cardinal Robert Sarah, "But I cannot deny my founding religious base or Christianity to please Islam." He continues, "If it continues in this direction, Europe has no future." We'll appreciate your comments.
Okay. Thank you very much, for your question. It requires a whole lot of discussion on this, but I would like to say that, there have been attempts at these interreligious dialogues at different levels. And I have participated, for example, at Temple University, where at the dialogue forum, where we had invited, sometimes it was a group of students from, say, one time from Southeast Asia, Muslims and Christians. At another time, they were students from the Middle East, Catholics, Muslims. From Southeast Asia, we had Buddhists, we had students representing different religions, and then they were brought to Temple University, and they were, they spent some time here in the United States, and they had lectures, discussions, presentations that have to do with interreligious understanding, not just interreligious understanding, but also diversity. Okay, but we have to start somewhere. Okay, we may not see the results right away, but I think it is very interesting to see how people from different religions brought together, can exchange ideas. I know that it is very difficult sometimes when people are very set on the primacy and, their religion as only the legitimate one. But I feel that opening them up to this kind of discussions is a way that, it might not bring immediate results, but it is a way of opening people to other points of view. So, there have been so many efforts done here at the Dialogue Forum in Philadelphia, and I thought it was very interesting. One time I participated, one of the one of the seminars that I participated in had some Muslims that refused to accept any other view. And it was very difficult that even another Muslim who was part of the speakers mentioned that, well, I don't know how my fellow Muslims do this dialogue because they had their own interpretation of Islam and they were not willing to accept others. But there is a hope that at least we open up, maybe sometime in the future, they will be able, to exchange ideas with us and recognize that while we have some differences, there are also some shared ideas.
Okay, thank you. Just a note on Cardinal Sarah's comment really reflects how deep our negative view about Islam, no? When we begin to fear that Europe will be dominated by the Muslims in the future. Now, there's another question for you, Dr. Vivian, from Lily Mendoza from Detroit, Michigan. Can the speaker please address as well the role of the intentional encouragement of Christian settlement of Mindanao, styling Mindanao as the land of promise in the ongoing Muslim-Christian conflict around land?
Okay, thank you very much for the question. I mean, the issue of land is really one of the major irritants in Muslim-Christian relations. I had mentioned in my talk about how the post-independence government had also continued with policies of the colonial governments. And this is one of those things, the agricultural colonization of Mindanao, where Christian settlers were brought into Mindanao. Then you also have these programs calling people to come to Mindanao because this is the promised land. You also have the EDCOR settlements where the members of the Hook movement who had surrendered were given land, in Mindanao. The problem was many of the lands that were given to the migrants who were Christians, by the way, were lands that belonged to Muslims. Now, the new migrants were given titles to the land, but the Muslims did not have land titles because they practiced the traditional way of owning the land. So the land was just handed down from one generation to the next. They did not have written documents. So when these migrants who were sponsored, many of them were sponsored by the government, came in and they were given land titles, the Muslims lost their lands. So that was a major irritant. It continues up to the present time, and there have been land disputes. So I think the government also tried to be more sensitive to that now, but the issue has not been completely eliminated yet.
Okay, thank you. Let me answer first this question from Joseph Santos Leon, addressed to me. Would you be able to elaborate on the IFI and American colonialism and what liberalizing effects this may have had on Philippine culture? For example, Taft's Unitarianism and relationship with IFI leadership. Well, in the 1930s, the first head of the IFI, Gregorio Aglipay, was drawn to Unitarian views that hold that God is one singular entity, disavowing the Trinitarian perspective, which most of the Aglipay's, the IFI members would hold. No? But the Unitarian Convention passed a resolution for Philippine independence and admitted the IFI to the International Association of Liberal Christianity. Also, well, of course, it's the It's during the U.S. American regime that the Protestants entered the Philippines, and most of those who supported the IFI in its beginnings were those outside the Catholic Church, no, the Protestants. So in 1961, they have entered into full communion with the Episcopal Church. And also today, the IFI is a member of the National Christian Church of the Philippines and the World Council of Churches. Also, in this celebration of the 500 years of Christianity, the Roman Catholic Church now issued a statement that the formation of the IFI was not against the Catholic Church, but rather against the continued domination of Spanish bishops and priests in the dioceses and parishes of the colony, and also encourages continued journeying with the IFI. Okay. For the next question, well, this is from Julius K. Cato, Ontario, Canada, addressed to Dr. Pilario. Thanks so much, Dr. Pilario, for your thought-provoking lecture. At the end, you mentioned instead of missio ad gentes, perhaps missio inter gentes, or a dialogical ecclesiology would be better paradigms. Could you give some concrete examples of how that would be realized on the ground within the Philippines and among Filipino diaspora communities abroad?
Thank you very much for the question, Dr. Cato. The discourse on missio inter gentes has been long present in the Asian theological scene. Maybe with the initiation of Jonathan Tan, sometime in the late 1990s, and later adopted by the FABC. The question is, how can this be applied on the ground? I think the structures present in the, for instance, in the Mindanao context, the Bishop Olama Conference is a big structure of that dialogical ecclesiologies. But beyond the high-profile interreligious dialogue, there are actually dialogues happening in everyday life in the communities. The notion of basic human communities has long been accepted and accepted by the FABC. For instance, in Zamboanga, there is what you call Silsila movement, which has been doing interreligious work since the 1980s or earlier than that. Father Sebastiano de Ambra has been responsible for this. Ordinary people, maybe pastoral workers from parishes, but also from the Muslim side, come together and gather for maybe a month or so and live together the life. But beyond that, these formal movements, actually in schools too, there are, in fact, among the religious schools run by Catholics in the South, there are joint recollections given by an imam to both Catholics, Christians, and Muslims, or maybe a religious sister that having that recollection. I think the basic notion is to accept plural religious identities, or what is called multiple religious belonging. And in the context of the Filipino, that is not very difficult to accept. On the ground, these hard religious affiliations, does not actually happen. Anyone can go to a Catholic church one day and attend the service in an Episcopalian church in another. So I think this is the basic ecclesiological frame that's necessary for dialogue and dialogical ecclesiologies. Thank you. For the diaspora, I have not been very present to the diaspora community. I think we have to also look for that directions. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Danny. Well, Lenin Strobel, Dr. Strobel, who is a speaker for tomorrow's webinar, would also like to respond to the question. Lenny?
I think she's
maybe-
unable to. Yeah. Move on to
Okay.
the next one. Yeah.
Well, Father Albert also wants to respond to the same question. Father Albert?
Okay, I worked in Mindanao for many years, and I realized that one hidden platform for dialogue or non-dialogue is the curriculum, the textbooks. When I was in Zamboanga, we made a study of 60 textbooks in CBCA, or Philippine history. And we realized that there's very little mention of Mindanao. And within this few pages of mention of Mindanao, you have a fewer pages on Muslims and even fewer pages about the indigenous peoples. Mostly the indigenous peoples are mentioned in prehistory. They are not contemporaries. The mentions of Muslims are negative in images. And so these textbooks proliferate. They are being used. And the teachers who are not very sensitive simply propagate all these things. Like, for example, even one poster that says, mga pambansang sagisag, national symbols, national food, national house, and then national food is lechon. And so it silently, it hurts. It hurts the sensitivity of some sectors in society. And yet, we don't have a good textbook that is fair. And so that one platform is an open field for intervention. Now, we tried to produce 4-meter long infographics of Mindanao history. And the way we did it was to expand the concept of history to include political history, economic history, cultural history, even ecological history. And we extended history to archaeological periods. And the result was, the process was tense. You know, some Muslims would say, why do you call it Mindanao? Where is Sulu? And when we added Sulu, the Maguindanao told me, Father, you're dividing us. Why put a hyphen between Mindanao and Sulu? It should just be Mindanao. In other words, when we talk about dialogue, it's not just in the field or in the marketplace or in the classroom or in the temples. It's in the educational system, particularly in textbooks, etc. So that would be a good platform where intervention is really demanded.
Thank you, Father Albert. Well, you are already there, so the next question is addressed to you. I am wondering, is it necessary that College of Bishops in the Philippines ask for forgiveness, or even in different countries, even though they are not present or the cause of the problems or abuses we are now experiencing? For example, the scandals of the religious. If yes, and if they should apologize most of the time, does this presupposes that they are just taking the responsibility what the abuser has done, or it could fall on covering their tracks and to avoid publicize the matter?
Well, I mentioned, I talked about the workshop. Towards the end, they said, maybe we should come up with a document. And somehow it never came out. So that's why I mentioned it, although it happened a decade ago, because it remains an unfinished business. So the Catholic Church hierarchy is still trying to grope with the right discourse, the right wounded discourse to express apology, while at the same time, a good number of priests and religious are also fighting along with the indigenous groups. So how do you say sorry while at the same time joining the indigenous peoples in their struggle against some other enemies at present? So it's kind of a difficult thing. So in the initial reaction of some people would be just to cover up, but eventually, of course, that makes the problem worse. We need to develop and accept and be familiar and humbly adopt a wounded discourse, a wounded language, where we admit to wrongdoing, but in a way that does not disempower us in helping them. Yeah. Okay. So I had an experience, a parallel experience when I was in Zamboanga. I was beginning to help in the promotion of the fight against human trafficking. But then somebody asked for help in giving sanctuary to the corruption within the NGO fighting human trafficking. So how do you handle that? There was corruption, big corruption within the biggest NGO fighting this huge human trafficking. So how do you handle that? How do you expose the corruption within the NGO in such a way that you don't really just empower the traffickers? So if you have more concrete suggestion, I think that this is a real need. So people are grappling in finding the right words and the right tone in saying sorry, but at the same time continuing fighting for this sector.
For Malu, Filipinos are all over the world, including places where there is a lot of discrimination and more specifically anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. Filipinos in these places are also overt in expressing their faiths and traditions during Lent and Advent. How should Christians in Israel, in Europe, or the US, for example, reappropriate the use of the Passion right now? How do we avoid anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism? And then the other question is about the UDHR and UNSDG. You mentioned that the Passion can be also a component of the UDHR and UNSDG. Can you expound on this and make the connection more explicit?
Thank you very much for the questions, Dr. Agnes, and for the one who asked the question. For the first one, what do we do with the Passion in the context of the diaspora Filipinos? I did ask my missionary friends in Israel what they do there, because there's about 25,000 Filipinos working as caregivers in Israel. And I was told that they do not read the Passion there, at least for those people that my two missionary friends know. Why? In the first place, because it is not a holiday in Israel. So there is no way they could do the Passion as they would want to do. And another thing, I think they are so much more into the other practices of the Passion, like visita iglesia, or visiting the way of doing the way of the cross, for instance, I think, and attending the liturgy in the churches rather than doing the Passion. which is, as you have seen, it is chanted like 24 hours together. And it's very difficult for people to do that if they are mostly in the caregiving in-house with the Jewish people that they are caring for. So that's very difficult. In terms of avoiding anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism, this is a very, very challenging task, I say. Of course, there's not a lot, I think, of people who are aware of the Passion within the context of the US and Europe or outside the Philippines. Maybe there are more people who are doing that here in the Philippines. When I stayed for quite a number of years in Europe, I did not hear of any invitation to do the Passion. But in the US, I did see that last year there was an online invitation to do the Passion or the Pabasa. What do we do with it? I think that it's high time for us to take a look at it, maybe to rethink the text, to begin talking with the people who pray or who go through the symbolic meaning and the importance of the Passion for those who pray this. But in dialogue with theologians, in dialogue with poets, so that the literary importance of the Passion is preserved, but at the same time that it will respond to the new reality that we have. If you have seen in my presentation, there is actually a genealogy of the Passion. So there are editions. There were changes that were made. So what's keeping us from doing something that will respond to the need for the retelling of the Passion of Jesus in a sound way, because Filipinos are that's part of the culture. That's in terms of singing, but at the same time to make it more gospel based. So there is still the problem of the treatment of Jesus by the Jewish leaders, but that it will be more discerning, that it will embody the present teaching and better theological understanding of anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. There are also many documents from the Catholic Church, from the Vatican, because from this perspective, there's the Nostra Aetate. There are notes on how to teach catechism from this perspective, trying to balance, for instance, the themes in the biblical and in the Catholic tradition, like how do you deal with the promised Messiah and the fulfillment of Jesus, of this in Jesus, and at the same time for the Jews it's not yet fulfillment. How do we deal with continuity and newness of the Christian faith, singularity of Jesus and the universality of the call, and the call that was never revoked for the Jewish people, and the uniqueness of Jesus and the importance of the Jewish faith. So those are important aspects, I think, that we need to have a proactive, more dynamic way of doing this, and at the same time for the scholarly community to have more avenues for pastoral discussion in terms of this very important issues. Which brings me to why do I think that how we deal with the Passion is something that is related to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I think the way they have been painted in the Passion can foment, if we understand the Filipino there, because there are also very, very deep Tagalog words that I'm not sure if Filipinos still understand them. But with the way they have been painted, like traitorous Jews and so on, they can easily foment the different kinds of conspiracy theories against the Jews that resulted in the Holocaust and continue even now with the Holocaust deniers. So why is it related to the UDHR? Just like with the cases with the Muslims, with the indigenous peoples, I think the basic human rights is very important. And at the same time, UDHR says that everyone has the right to choose their own religion, and that everyone should not be discriminated because of their own religion and race. And when you see this in terms of the conspiracy theories, for instance, in relation to COVID, how it's been linked to the Jews and also to Asians, with the increasing hate against Asians in the US, for instance, these are all related to the UDHR. And in that same manner, it relates to the UNSDG number 16, which calls for stronger justice and peace in social institutions, which unfortunately forgets that the churches are very strong and important and large institutions. So I do think that our discussion about how the Jews are treated and depicted in the Passion negatively, like a traitorous people, and how it can foment discrimination is a question of Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the SDGs. So thank you for the questions.
Thank you, Doc Malu. There are still a number of questions in the Q&A box, but we no longer have time to entertain them. But thank you once again to all our speakers and those who asked questions and all the participants who took time to be with us today. We hope to see you again tomorrow, same time, for the second part of this two-day webinar, which will focus on reappropriation, resistance, and decolonization. I shall now call on our co-organizer, Dr. Cristina Liedo Gomez from the Australian Institute of Theological Education, to give some final remarks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brazal, and thank you so much, Drs. Angeles, Pilario, Ibita, and Alejo. It's been such a pleasure to have you and to enrich our thoughts on what it means to actually celebrate 500 years of Christianity, how complex it is to celebrate it. So we request that those participants, please fill in the evaluation form for today. That link will be posted in the chat right now, and that will form, that's a requirement, especially for those who want to get a certificate of participation. You'll get that certificate of participation straight after you fill in the evaluation form on day 2 as well. Thank you so much to the sponsors. They're going to be put on the chat box as well. Georgetown University, Berkeley Center, Department of Theology and Religious Studies, Catholic Studies Program, De La Salle University, BBI, Ecclesiological Investigations Network, Dakateo, Lord Boston Webinar Series, Religious Educators Association of the Philippines, San Carlos Major Seminary, Cebu, Philippines, Pacific School of Religion and Graduate Theological Union, Berkeley, University of San Francisco, California, Union Theological Seminary, and the Philippine X and Philippine Studies Working Group. A special thank you to the Religious Educators Association of the Philippines for taking care of the evaluation and certificates. And a special thank you to the DLSU DTRE internalization team for your hard work behind the scenes. Thank you to Professor Lefebvre, Professor Brazal, Ruth Gopen, and Shimeng and Willard Macaran for making this event happen. Yeah, there was so much going back and forth. And for those who are interested in the longer versions of the talks given today, there will be an anthology that will be put together by myself and Dr. Brazal. So just wait for that. That will be published through Ecclesiological Investigations Palgrave Macmillan series. And on this note, Ecclesiological Investigations has a conference coming up on decolonizing churches in this June. It'll be held in hybrid mode. So you can attend online or via in person in Puerto Rico, if you can make it there. And finally, we hope to see you tomorrow. Tomorrow, we're going to be exploring what it means to reappropriate, resist, and decolonize. Thank you so much for attending, and we hope to see you tomorrow.